The wagon lurched into a rut deep enough to swallow hope, and Sarah Jenkins felt her stomach drop as the remaining wheels splintered with a crack that echoed across the empty Wyoming plains like a gunshot. She sat there in the sudden stillness, hands still gripping leather reins attached to the two horses that had already died 3 days back, their bodies left beside the trail because she had lacked the strength to move them or the tools to bury them properly. The sun hammered down on her bonnet, and dust coated her throat until each breath tasted like defeat. Her father had died of fever in Missouri. Her mother had succumbed to cholera in Nebraska. Her brother, Sweet Thomas, had been kicked by a horse outside Fort Laramie and had lasted only 2 agonizing days before the infection took him. Now she sat alone on a broken wagon in the middle of nowhere, 23 years old and entirely, utterly alone. Sarah climbed down from the wagon seat, her legs trembling from exhaustion and hunger. She had not eaten a proper meal in 5 days. The hardtack had run out. The dried meat had spoiled in the heat. She had been surviving on water from streams and the occasional handful of berries she recognized from her mother's teachings. The dress she wore, once a respectable blue calico, hung on her frame like a shroud, stained with dust and sweat and the evidence of too many hard miles. She looked around at the landscape stretching endlessly in every direction. Pine-covered mountains rose to the west, their peaks still crowned with snow despite the summer heat. The trail she had been following wound through sagebrush and scattered rocks, heading toward those mountains and the promise of Gold Hill, a mining town her father had been determined to reach. He had heard there were opportunities there, a chance to start over after their farm in Ohio had failed. That dream seemed like a lifetime ago now. Sarah pulled her few remaining possessions from the wagon. A single change of clothes, her mother's Bible, a small leather pouch containing $3.20, and a daguerreotype of her family taken 5 years ago when they had all been together and whole. She wrapped these items in a blanket and fashioned a crude bundle she could carry over her shoulder. Then she started walking. The sun crossed the sky as she walked, and her feet began to blister inside her worn boots. She had no idea how far Gold Hill might be. The last travelers she had encountered, a family heading east in retreat from the hard life of mining camps, had told her it was perhaps 50 miles ahead. That had been a week ago. But 50 miles might as well have been 500 when you were alone and on foot with almost no supplies. As the sun began to sink toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if she had possessed the energy to appreciate beauty, Sarah knew she needed to find shelter for the night. The temperature would plummet once darkness fell, and she had learned enough on this journey to know that exposure could kill as surely as hunger or thirst. She spotted an outcropping of rock rising from the prairie like a broken tooth. It would provide some protection from the wind at least. She made her way toward it, her legs moving mechanically, her mind drifting in and out of focus. She kept thinking of her mother's face, the way she had looked in those last fevered hours, whispering about Ohio and the apple trees that bloomed in spring. She thought of Thomas, who had been only 19 and had never even kissed a girl. She thought of her father's determination, the way he had kept pushing them forward even when everything seemed to argue for turning back. When Sarah reached the rocks, she discovered they formed a small sheltered space, almost like a shallow cave. She crawled inside, grateful for the protection, and arranged her blanket around her shoulders. Her stomach cramped with hunger, but she had nothing to ease it. She pulled out her mother's Bible and held it against her chest like a talisman, and then she closed her eyes and prayed for the first time in weeks. She was not sure God was listening anymore, not after everything that had happened, but the familiar words brought a small measure of comfort nonetheless. She must have fallen asleep, because when she opened her eyes again, the sky had turned fully dark and stars blazed overhead in such profusion that they seemed almost within reach. A full moon hung low on the horizon, silver and enormous, and someone was watching her. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she registered the figure standing perhaps 20 feet away, silhouetted against the moonlit sky. The figure was large, unmistakably male, and utterly still. She scrambled backward against the rock, her hand reaching instinctively for something, anything, to use as a weapon, but finding nothing. "Easy now," the figure said, and his voice was deep and surprisingly gentle. "Did not mean to frighten you. Saw your tracks heading off the main trail and wanted to make sure you were not in trouble." "I have a gun," Sarah lied, trying to make her voice sound strong and failing miserably. "No, you do not," the man said, but there was no threat in his tone. "If you did, you would have drawn it by now." "I am going to step closer so you can see me properly. Going to move slow." He did exactly as he said, stepping forward into the moonlight, and Sarah found herself staring at a man unlike any she had encountered in her 23 years. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the stars behind him. His hair fell past his shoulders in dark waves, and a full beard covered the lower half of his face. He wore buckskin clothing that looked as though it had been made by hand, and a large knife hung at his belt alongside what looked like a tomahawk. His arms, bare below rolled-up sleeves, were corded with muscle that spoke of a life lived in constant physical labor. Everything about him suggested strength and capability and a kind of wildness that matched the landscape surrounding them. "My name is Benjamin Drake," he said. "Most folks call me Ben. I have a camp about a mile from here. I have food and water and a fire. You look like you could use all three." Sarah wanted to speak, but her throat had closed up with a combination of fear and relief and something else she could not quite name. She managed a small nod. Ben stepped closer, moving with surprising grace for someone so large. "When did you last eat?" "I had some berries yesterday," Sarah whispered. "Or maybe it was the day before. I am not entirely certain." Something flickered across his face, an expression that might have been anger or concern or both. "Where is your family? Your wagon?" "All dead," she said, and hearing the words spoken aloud made them real in a way they had not been before. "The wagon broke. Everyone else died before that. Fever, cholera, an accident. I am the only one left." Ben was silent for a long moment, and Sarah could feel his gaze on her even in the darkness. Finally, he said, "Can you walk? Or shall I carry you?" "I can walk," Sarah said quickly, because the thought of being carried by this massive stranger was somehow more terrifying than anything else that had happened to her. "All right then. Follow me. Stay close." He turned and began walking, and Sarah forced herself to her feet, gathering her meager bundle and stumbling after him. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else, distant and unreliable, but she pushed forward through sheer force of will. She had survived everything else. She could survive this too. They walked through the moonlit landscape, and Sarah found herself watching the way Ben moved ahead of her. He seemed utterly at home in this wilderness, as though he were as much a part of it as the rocks and sagebrush. He did not hesitate or stumble, even in the darkness. He simply moved forward with absolute confidence, occasionally glancing back to make sure she still followed. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only about 20 minutes, Sarah saw the glow of a fire ahead. As they drew closer, she could make out a small camp nestled in a grove of cottonwood trees near what sounded like a creek. A sturdy canvas tent stood near the fire, and 2 horses grazed nearby on a long tether. The whole scene looked impossibly inviting after her days of desperate solitude. "Sit," Ben said, gesturing to a log near the fire. "I will get you food." Sarah sank down onto the log, so grateful to be off her feet that she nearly wept. The heat from the fire felt like heaven against her skin, which had grown cold during the walk. She watched as Ben moved around the camp with practiced efficiency, pulling items from leather bags and a small wooden chest. Within minutes, he had placed a tin plate in her hands containing johnnycakes, dried venison that had been soaked in water until it was tender, and what looked like wild onions cooked in fat. "Eat slow," he cautioned. "Your stomach will not handle much at first." Sarah tried to follow his advice, but the first bite of food tasted so good that she nearly sobbed. She forced herself to chew slowly, to take small bites, even though everything in her screamed to devour it all as quickly as possible. Ben handed her a cup of water from a canteen, and she drank in careful sips. While she ate, Ben busied himself around the camp, giving her space and time to compose herself. She studied him in the firelight, taking in details she had missed in the darkness. His face, what she could see of it beneath the beard, was weathered and tanned from constant exposure to the elements. His eyes, when they caught the light, were a startling blue-green, like a mountain lake. His hands, as he moved through various tasks, were large and scarred but surprisingly deft. This was a man who had lived hard and survived, she realized. A man who knew how to exist in places where most people would perish. When she had finished eating, moving more slowly toward the end as her stomach began to protest the sudden influx of food, Ben settled onto another log across the fire from her. "You said everyone died," he said quietly. "Tell me what happened." So Sarah told him. She told him about her father's dream of starting over in Gold Hill, about the wagon train they had joined in Missouri, about the fever that had taken her father just 2 weeks into the journey. She told him about the cholera outbreak that had swept through their group in Nebraska, claiming her mother and a dozen others. She told him about Thomas and the horse and the terrible 2 days of watching him fade. She told him about continuing on alone because she had not known what else to do, about the string of disasters that had left her wagon broken, and her supplies exhausted, and her hope worn down to almost nothing. Ben listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving her face. When she finally fell silent, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Gold Hill is about 30 miles northwest of here," he said. "It is a rough place. Mining camp, mostly men, hard drinking, harder living. Not really the kind of place for a woman alone." "I have nowhere else to go," Sarah said, and her voice broke on the last word despite her efforts to keep it steady. "Everything we had went into the journey west. I have $3 to my name. No family left anywhere. I have to go somewhere." Ben leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "I have a cabin about 10 miles from here, up in the mountains. Built it myself 3 years ago. I trap during winter, hunt, and trade the rest of the year. It is isolated, but it is comfortable and safe. You could stay there while you figure out what comes next. I could take you to Gold Hill after you have rested and recovered your strength if that is still what you want." Sarah stared at him. "Why would you help me? You do not even know me." "Because you need help," Ben said simply. "Because leaving you out here alone would be the same as killing you myself. Because I have the means to help and it would be wrong not to offer. I cannot pay you. Did not ask you to." Sarah felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had cried enough on this journey. "How do I know you are not going to hurt me?" Ben met her gaze steadily. "You do not know that. You do not know anything about me except what I have told you. But consider this. If I meant you harm, I could have done it already. You were alone, exhausted, unarmed. I am offering you food and shelter until you are strong enough to make your own choices about what happens next. That offer is genuine. But if you would rather I take you to Gold Hill now, I will do that instead. It is your choice." Sarah thought about Gold Hill, about arriving in a rough mining camp with no money, no family, no prospects. She thought about what happened to women in those situations. She had heard stories. Then she looked at Ben, at this massive stranger who had found her when she had been at her lowest point, who had fed her and was offering her help without asking for anything in return. It was a risk either way. Everything was a risk now. But something in his steady gaze and the calm competence with which he moved through the world made her want to trust him. "I would like to go to your cabin," she said quietly. "If the offer is genuine." "It is," Ben said. "We will leave at first light. For now, you can sleep in the tent. I will stay out here by the fire. I cannot take your tent. You can and you will. You need proper rest. I have slept under the stars more times than I can count. One more night will not hurt me." He stood and gestured toward the tent. Sarah rose on shaky legs and made her way to the opening. Inside, she found a bedroll laid out on a canvas floor with blankets neatly folded at one end. It looked like the most luxurious bed she had ever seen. She crawled inside, pulling the blankets over herself, and felt her body begin to relax for the first time in what seemed like forever. Through the open tent flap, she could see Ben settling by the fire, his back against a log, his long legs stretched out before him. She watched him for a few minutes, this mountain man who had appeared like something out of a story just when she had needed someone most. Then exhaustion pulled her down into sleep so deep it felt like drowning. Sarah woke to the smell of coffee and bacon and the soft sounds of morning in a wilderness camp. For a moment, she was disoriented, unsure where she was or how she had gotten there. Then memory flooded back and she sat up quickly, her heart racing. "Easy," Ben's voice came from outside the tent. "Sun has only been up about an hour. Take your time." Sarah pushed aside the blankets and emerged from the tent, blinking in the morning light. The sky was a pale blue, just beginning to deepen toward the color it would hold at midday. Ben stood by the fire, tending a skillet where bacon sizzled. Coffee steamed in a pot set on rocks near the flames. He glanced up as she appeared, and something that might have been a smile moved beneath his beard. "There is a creek just through those trees," he said, pointing. "Water is cold but clean if you want to wash up. I will have breakfast ready when you return." Sarah nodded and made her way toward the sound of running water. The creek was indeed cold, fed by snowmelt from the mountains, but it felt glorious against her dusty skin. She washed her face and hands and neck, relishing the feeling of being even marginally clean again. When she returned to camp, Ben had laid out breakfast. Bacon, more johnnycakes and coffee so strong it nearly made her gasp. They ate in companionable silence, and then Ben began breaking down the camp with swift efficiency. Sarah tried to help, but she quickly realized she was more hindrance than assistance. He had a system, a way of doing things that spoke of long practice, and she did not know where anything belonged or how it should be packed. So instead she rolled up the bedding from the tent and tried to stay out of his way. Within an hour, everything was packed and secured on the two horses. Ben helped Sarah mount one of them, and she tried not to show how much the simple act of climbing into the saddle hurt her blistered feet and exhausted muscles. Then they were moving, heading northwest toward the mountains. The landscape gradually changed as they rode. The flat prairie gave way to rolling hills, then to foothills carpeted with pine and aspen. The air grew cooler and carried the scent of evergreen and cold streams. Sarah found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the horse's gait, letting the peaceful surroundings work on her frayed nerves. Ben rode slightly ahead, guiding them along paths that were barely visible to Sarah's eyes, but that he navigated without hesitation. Occasionally, he would point out features of the landscape: a good place to find berries, a spring with the sweetest water in the territory, a meadow where elk gathered at dawn. He spoke little otherwise, but his silence was not uncomfortable. It felt more like the quiet of someone who had learned to exist without the constant need for conversation, someone who was comfortable in his own company. They stopped once around midday to rest the horses and eat a simple meal of jerky and hardtack from Ben's supplies. Sarah sat on a fallen log and watched as Ben checked the horses' hooves and gave them grain from a bag tied to one of the saddles. His care for the animals was evident in every movement, and Sarah found herself wondering about this man who lived alone in the mountains. "How long have you been out here?" she asked. Ben glanced up from his inspection of a horse's foreleg. "In these mountains, 3 years. In the territories generally, about 8 years now." "Where were you before?" "Pennsylvania. Worked in my father's smithy until I was 18. Then worked as a blacksmith for another few years. But I never took to town life. Too many people, too much noise. When I had saved enough money, I headed west. Spent time as an Army scout, a freight wagon guard, did some prospecting. Eventually ended up here." He straightened and met her eyes. "What about you? What did your family do before this journey?" "My father farmed in Ohio. We had 80 acres, grew mostly corn and wheat. It was a good life for a while. But then we had 2 bad harvests in a row, and my father went into debt. He sold everything to pay what he owed and to fund this trip west. He was certain we could start over, that things would be better." She looked down at her hands. "I suppose he was wrong. He could not have known what would happen," Ben said. "Sometimes bad luck just piles up, not anyone's fault." They continued on after the rest stop, and by late afternoon, Sarah could see they were climbing higher into the mountains. The air had grown noticeably cooler, and the character of the forest had changed. Massive pine trees towered overhead, and the ground was soft with years of fallen needles. A sense of deep peace pervaded these woods, as though the world outside could not quite reach this high. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, Ben guided them into a small valley nestled between 2 ridges. Sarah saw the cabin almost immediately and felt a rush of surprise at its solidity. She had been expecting something rough, barely more than a lean-to. Instead, she found herself looking at a well-built log structure with a stone chimney and real glass windows. A covered porch ran along the front, and a small barn stood about 50 yards away with a corral attached. "You built all this yourself?" she asked, unable to keep the astonishment from her voice. "Mostly," Ben said. "Had some help with the stone work. A prospector I knew was skilled with that sort of thing. But the rest, yes." He dismounted and helped Sarah down from her horse. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground, and Ben steadied her with one large hand on her elbow. "You are more exhausted than you realize," he said. "Come inside. I will tend to the horses and then get a fire going." The inside of the cabin was as much a surprise as the outside had been. Sarah had expected something crude and rough, the dwelling of a man who lived alone and cared little for comfort. Instead, she found a single large room that was surprisingly well appointed. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A sturdy wooden table with 2 chairs sat near the kitchen area, which featured a cast iron stove and shelves stocked with provisions. A comfortable-looking bed occupied one corner, with several thick quilts folded at its foot. Pegs on the walls held various tools and items of clothing. Furs covered the floor, making the space warm and inviting. Books lined a shelf near the bed, perhaps 20 volumes, their spines worn from use. Sarah stood in the center of the room, slowly turning to take it all in. "This is beautiful," she said softly. Ben, who had followed her inside carrying her small bundle, looked almost embarrassed. "It suits me. The bed is yours. I will make a pallet near the fire." "No," Sarah said quickly. "I cannot take your bed. I can sleep near the fire. You need proper rest. You are half-starved and exhausted. You will take the bed, and that is final." His tone left no room for argument, though it remained gentle. "Now I am going to tend the horses. Make yourself comfortable. There is a basin and pitcher over there if you want to wash. I will bring in water from the well when I return." He left before she could protest further, and Sarah found herself alone in the cabin. She walked slowly around the space, taking in details. The books on the shelf were a varied collection. Novels by Dickens and Cooper, volumes of poetry, practical guides on farming and animal husbandry, even a worn copy of Shakespeare's plays. The quilts on the bed, when she examined them, were clearly handmade but with surprising skill. The whole place spoke of a man who valued beauty and comfort even in isolation, who had built himself not just a shelter but a true home. Sarah poured water from the pitcher into the basin and washed her face and hands more thoroughly than she had been able to at the creek. Then she sank down onto one of the chairs at the table and simply sat, allowing herself to absorb the fact that she was safe, that she had food and shelter, that for the first time in weeks she did not have to be terrified about what the next hour or day might bring. Ben returned carrying 2 buckets of water, which he poured into a large container near the stove. Then he set about building a fire in the fireplace with swift, practiced movements. Within minutes, flames were crackling cheerfully, driving away the chill that had crept into the cabin. "Are you hungry?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder at Sarah. "I could eat," she admitted. "But please let me help. I feel useless just sitting here." Ben studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right. There is a root cellar accessed through that trapdoor. Can you bring up some potatoes and carrots? And there is a smoked ham hanging down there as well. We will have a proper meal tonight." Working together, they prepared dinner. Sarah found the task soothing after so many days of wandering and fear. She peeled vegetables while Ben sliced the ham and set it to frying. He mixed up biscuit dough and placed it in a Dutch oven, which he set among the coals of the fire. The smells that filled the cabin made Sarah's mouth water. As they cooked, they talked. Sarah told Ben more about her life in Ohio, about the farm and the neighbors and the small church where her family had worshipped every Sunday. Ben told her about his early years in Pennsylvania, about learning blacksmithing from his father, about the restlessness that had driven him westward. His voice, deep and measured, had a calming quality that Sarah found herself responding to. She realized she felt more at ease with this near stranger than she had felt in months, perhaps longer. When the food was ready, they sat together at the table and ate. The ham was salty and perfectly cooked. The vegetables were tender and buttery. The biscuits were light and flaky. Sarah ate slowly, mindful of Ben's earlier warning about overwhelming her stomach, but she savored every bite. After dinner, Sarah insisted on cleaning up. Ben let her, though he stayed nearby, drying dishes as she washed them in a basin of heated water. The domesticity of the scene struck Sarah as both strange and wonderful. Here she was, in a cabin in the Wyoming wilderness, washing dishes beside a mountain man who looked like he could wrestle a bear. Yet it felt natural, comfortable, right in a way she could not quite articulate. When the dishes were done and put away, Ben added more wood to the fire and gestured toward the comfortable chair positioned near the hearth. "Sit and warm yourself. I am going to step outside and check on a few things before full dark. I will be back shortly." Sarah sank into the chair, grateful for its cushioned seat. The fire crackled pleasantly, and the warmth seeped into her bones. She felt cleaner than she had in weeks, with a full stomach and a safe place to sleep. The contrast to her situation just 24 hours earlier was so stark it made her dizzy. When Ben returned, he carried an armful of firewood, which he stacked near the hearth. Then he began pulling blankets and furs from a chest, arranging them into a pallet near the fire. "You should sleep soon," he said. "Your body needs rest to recover." Sarah knew he was right, but she felt strangely reluctant to end the evening. "Will you tell me more about this place? How you came to be here?" Ben settled onto his makeshift bed, his back against the wall, his long legs stretched toward the fire. "Not much to tell, really. After I left the army, I spent a winter as a scout at Fort Laramie. Met an old trapper there named Joe Crawford. He told me about these mountains, about the wildlife and the solitude. Something about the way he described it resonated with me. So when spring came, I headed this way. Found this valley and knew it was where I wanted to be." "Do you ever get lonely?" "Sometimes," Ben admitted. "But I am comfortable with my own company. And I am not completely isolated. I go into Gold Hill every few months for supplies and to trade furs. I know some of the other trappers and hunters in these mountains. We help each other out when needed. It is a different kind of community than what you would find in a town, but it exists." "Have you ever thought about going back east?" "No," Ben said, and there was absolute certainty in his voice. "That life was not for me. I need space around me, room to breathe. Out here, I feel like I can be who I truly am without having to conform to everyone else's expectations." Sarah nodded slowly, thinking about her own life, about the expectations that had shaped her days in Ohio. Good women married and raised children and kept house and attended church and minded their manners. There had been little room for anything else, little opportunity to discover who she might be beyond those narrow confines. This journey west, terrible as it had also been the most freedom she had ever known. "What will you do?" Ben asked quietly. "Once you have recovered, I mean. Do you still plan to go to Gold Hill?" "I do not know," Sarah admitted. "A week ago, I would have said yes without hesitation, because I could not imagine any alternative. But now I am not so sure. You were right when you said it is a hard place for a woman alone, and I have no skills that would be useful there. I can cook and clean and sew and manage a household, but those are not talents that will earn me independence." "You could stay here," Ben said, and then seemed surprised by his own words. "I mean, for a while longer, until you have a clearer sense of what you want to do next. Winter is still months away. You would have time to think, to recover your strength." Sarah looked at him across the firelit room. "You would let me stay, just like that? This cabin has room for two. I have food enough for both of us, especially with summer coming on. The garden will produce soon, and game is plentiful. It would be no hardship." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "And truthfully, your company has been welcome. It has been a long time since I shared a meal and conversation with someone. But people would talk. If anyone knew I was staying here, who would know? And what would it matter? We are not in a town with neighbors watching and judging. We are in the mountains, living our own lives. If you are concerned about propriety, I can sleep in the barn. But I will not send you off to face an uncertain future in a mining camp when there is another option available." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of anxiety she had not even realized she was carrying. "Are you certain? I do not want to be a burden." "You would not be. And perhaps you could help me with some things around here. I am not much for mending or keeping things tidy. If you were willing to take on some of those tasks, we could call it an even exchange." It was a gracious fiction, and they both knew it. Sarah would be getting far more from this arrangement than Ben, but the fact that he was offering it in a way that preserved her dignity made her throat tighten with gratitude. "Then yes," she said softly. "I would like to stay, at least for a while." Ben nodded, something that might have been satisfaction crossing his face. Good. That is settled then. Now you really should get some rest. Tomorrow we can start getting you properly settled in. Sarah rose from the chair and made her way to the bed. She removed her boots, sighing with relief as her aching feet were freed, and then lay down on the mattress. It was stuffed with something soft, perhaps dried grasses or moss, and the quilts that covered it were thick and warm. She could see Ben from where she lay, his large form barely fitting on the pallet he had made, his eyes reflecting the firelight as he stared into the flames. "Ben," she said quietly. "Yes, thank you for everything. You saved my life." "Get some rest, Sarah," he said, his voice gentle. "We can talk more in the morning." Sarah closed her eyes and let sleep take her, and for the first time since her family had started this doomed journey westward, she felt something that might have been hope. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt both strange and natural. Sarah woke each morning to find Ben already up and about, tending to chores or hunting. She took over the cooking and cleaning, grateful to have useful work to occupy her hands and mind. Ben proved to be an easy person to share space with. He was quiet but not silent, helpful without being overbearing, and seemed genuinely pleased to have her company. As Sarah regained her strength, she began exploring the area around the cabin. The valley Ben had chosen for his home was beautiful in a way that took her breath away. A cold stream ran through it, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above. Meadows dotted with wildflowers lay between stands of evergreen forest. Wildlife was abundant. She saw deer, elk, rabbits, squirrels, and once, from a safe distance, a black bear. Ben showed her his garden, a substantial plot of carefully tended vegetables protected from deer by a sturdy fence. Potatoes, carrots, onions, peas, beans, and squash grew in neat rows. He had started these plants from seed in early spring, he explained, and they would provide much of his food for the coming winter. "I can help with the garden," Sarah offered. "My mother taught me well. We grew most of our own food back in Ohio." "I would appreciate that," Ben said. "My skills lean more toward hunting and building. I can keep a garden alive, but I lack the touch that makes things truly thrive." Working in the garden became one of Sarah's favorite tasks. There was something healing about putting her hands in the soil, about nurturing growing things. She weeded and watered and watched the plants respond to her care. Ben often worked nearby, splitting firewood or repairing tools, and they would talk as they worked, sharing stories about their pasts and observations about the world around them. Sarah learned that Ben was 28 years old, that his mother had died when he was young, that he had two older brothers who had stayed in Pennsylvania to work in the family business. She learned that he loved books, especially poetry, though he seemed almost embarrassed to admit this. She learned that he had a gift for working with his hands, that he could craft beautiful objects from wood and leather and metal. Ben, in turn, learned about Sarah's life. She told him about her childhood, about the one-room schoolhouse where she had received her education, about her love of music even though her family had been too poor to own a piano. She told him about the young man who had courted her back in Ohio, a farmer's son named William who had seemed pleasant enough, but who had never made her heart race. Their unofficial engagement had ended when her family had decided to move west, and she had felt more relief than sorrow at the parting. "Did you love him?" Ben asked one afternoon as they sat on the cabin's porch, shelling peas. "No," Sarah said honestly. "I liked him well enough, but I never felt what I thought love should feel like. My parents had loved each other truly. I could see it in the way they looked at each other, the way they moved together like two parts of a whole. I never felt even a shadow of that with William." "What do you think love should feel like?" Ben's voice was casual, but something in his tone made Sarah glance up. "I think it should feel like coming home," she said slowly, working through her thoughts as she spoke. "Like finding a place where you can be completely yourself without fear or pretense. Like being seen and known and accepted anyway. Does that sound foolish?" "No," Ben said quietly. "It sounds exactly right." Their eyes met, and something passed between them in that moment, something Sarah could not quite name, but that made her pulse quicken. Then Ben looked away, back down at the peas in his lap, and the moment passed. As the weeks went by, Sarah found herself thinking about Ben more and more. She noticed the way his hair caught the sunlight when he worked outside. She noticed the careful gentleness with which he handled small things despite his great strength. She noticed the sound of his laughter, which came more frequently as they grew more comfortable with each other. She noticed the way her heart seemed to beat a little faster when he entered a room. One evening, about a month after Sarah had arrived at the cabin, Ben suggested they eat dinner outside. "The weather is perfect," he said. "Seems a shame to waste it indoors." They carried their plates and cups out to the porch and sat on the steps, looking out over the meadow as the sun sank toward the mountains. The sky was a masterpiece of pinks and oranges and purples. Birds called from the forest. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. "I have been thinking," Ben said as they ate, "about how you said you loved music but never learned to play an instrument." "Yes, my family could never afford one." "Well, I have a mouth harp," Ben said. "It is not much, but I could teach you how to play it if you want." "I am not skilled enough to teach you much else, but that I could manage." Sarah felt a rush of pleasure at the offer. "I would love that." After dinner, Ben produced the harmonica from inside the cabin and showed her how to hold it, how to create different notes by pursing her lips and blowing or drawing air through the reeds. Sarah's first attempts produced sounds that made them both laugh, but gradually she began to understand the technique. Ben was a patient teacher, demonstrating over and over until she started to get the hang of it. "You are doing well," he said after about half an hour of practice. "Better than I did when I was learning." "Who taught you?" "The old trapper I mentioned, Joe Crawford. He could make that little instrument sing. Said music was necessary for keeping a man's soul alive through long winters." Sarah handed the harmonica back to Ben. "Will you play something?" He hesitated, then nodded. He brought the instrument to his lips and began to play. The tune that emerged was sweet and melancholy, a melody that spoke of loneliness and longing and the vast spaces of the western wilderness. Sarah felt goosebumps rise on her arms as she listened. She had not expected such artistry from this rough mountain man. When the song ended, she said softly, "That was beautiful. Just something I learned along the way." Ben stood and stretched, his large frame silhouetted against the darkening sky. "We should go in soon. The mosquitoes will be fierce once the light is fully gone." But Sarah was not ready to go inside yet. The evening was too lovely, and she felt energized rather than tired. "Could we stay out a little longer? It is such a beautiful night." Ben glanced at the sky where the first stars were beginning to appear. The moon, 3/4 full, hung low over the eastern ridge. "All right, for a little while." They sat in companionable silence as the darkness deepened and the stars multiplied overhead. Sarah had never seen so many stars as she had seen since coming west. The sky seemed infinite, spangled with light from horizon to horizon. "You know the constellations?" she asked. "Some." "My father taught me the major ones. See there." Ben pointed upward. "That is the Big Dipper. And if you follow those 2 stars at the end of the cup, they point to the North Star, which is part of the Little Dipper." Sarah followed his pointing finger, picking out the patterns he described. "What about that bright one there, low in the west?" "That is Venus. Not a star, but a planet." brightest thing in the sky besides the moon and sun. Ben's knowledge surprised her. She had fallen into the trap of assuming that because he lived simply and roughly, he must be uneducated. But he had clearly read widely and observed carefully. There was intelligence in him, along with the strength and capability. "Ben," Sarah said, and then paused, unsure how to phrase what she wanted to say. "Have you ever wished for a different life? For a wife and children and all the things most men want?" Ben was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "I thought about it when I was younger, but I knew the life I wanted was not compatible with what most women want. I could not imagine a woman being happy living the way I live, isolated in the mountains, away from society and comfort and security. So I made my peace with being alone. What if you met a woman who wanted the same kind of life you do?" Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "What if there was someone who would choose this over a town?" Ben turned to look at her, and even in the darkness, Sarah could feel the intensity of his gaze. "Sarah." Before he could say whatever he had been about to say, a sound from the forest interrupted them. It was a low growl, followed by the crack of a branch. Ben was on his feet instantly, every muscle tense. "Get inside," he said quietly. "Now." Sarah scrambled up and hurried into the cabin. Ben followed, pulling the door shut behind them and dropping the heavy wooden bar into place. He grabbed his rifle from above the door and checked that it was loaded. "What is it?" Sarah asked, her heart pounding. "Could be a bear or a mountain lion, something large by the sound of it." Ben moved to the window and peered out into the darkness. "Stay away from the windows." They waited in tense silence, listening. Sarah could hear her own breathing, the crackle of the fire, and then, from outside, the sound of something moving around the cabin. Something big. Ben kept his rifle ready, his eyes fixed on the window. Minutes passed that felt like hours. Finally, the sounds faded, moving away toward the north. "It is leaving," Ben said. "Probably caught our scent and decided we were not worth the trouble." Sarah realized she was shaking. Ben noticed and set the rifle aside, moving to her side. "You are all right. It is gone." "I did not realize there was so much danger out here." "There is always some danger," Ben said, "but it is manageable if you are careful and prepared. Animals generally avoid people if given the choice. That one was probably just curious." He guided her to the chair by the fire. "Sit. I will make you some tea. It will help settle your nerves." Sarah sank into the chair and watched as Ben heated water and brewed tea from dried herbs. He brought her a cup and she wrapped her hands around it, grateful for the warmth. "I am sorry," she said. "I should not be so frightened." "You must think me foolish." "I do not think any such thing," Ben said firmly. "You have been through more in the past few months than most people endure in a lifetime. You are allowed to be frightened. Hell, I was frightened. The trick is not letting fear paralyze you." He settled onto the edge of the hearth, his large frame somehow radiating protection and safety. Sarah looked at him and felt a rush of emotion so strong it nearly took her breath away. This man, this rough mountain man who could have left her to die on the prairie, who owed her nothing, who had instead taken her in and cared for her and made her feel safe for the first time in months. This man who played haunting melodies on a harmonica and read poetry and built beautiful things with his scarred hands. This man who looked at her like she mattered, like she was worth protecting. "Ben," she said softly. "Earlier, before we heard the animal, you were about to say something." "What was it?" Ben's gaze met hers, and in the firelight his eyes were the color of deep water. "I was going to say that I think I might have met such a woman, one who would choose this life, one who fits here like she was always meant to be here." Sarah's breath caught. "Ben." "I know it is too soon," he said quickly. "I know you have been through a terrible ordeal and you need time to heal and figure out what you want. I am not asking for anything, Sarah. I just want you to know that if you wanted to stay, not just for a few months but for always, I would welcome it. I would welcome you. Sarah set down her teacup with trembling hands. You do not have to be so careful with me. I am not made of glass. What are you saying? I am saying that I think I have been falling in love with you since the night you found me. I am saying that when I imagine my future, I cannot picture leaving this valley. I am saying that I have already chosen Ben. I have chosen you and this life and this place. Ben stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah saw wonder and disbelief and hope chase across his face. Then he moved, crossing the space between them in 2 long strides. He dropped to one knee in front of her chair so that his eyes were level with hers. You are certain, he asked, his voice rough. Because once you say it, once we start down this path, I will not be able to let you go. I will want to marry you and build a life with you and grow old with you in these mountains. You need to be certain. I am certain, Sarah said, and she reached out to touch his bearded face, feeling the warm, solid reality of him beneath her fingers. I have never been more certain of anything. Ben made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and then he was kissing her. His lips were warm and gentle despite the urgency Sarah could feel thrumming through him. She kissed him back, pouring into it all the loneliness and fear and hope that had been building inside her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ben rested his forehead against hers. I did not think this was possible, he whispered. I had convinced myself I would always be alone. Well, you were wrong, Sarah said, and she felt giddy with joy and relief and a fierce certainty that she had somehow found her way home. You are stuck with me now. Ben laughed, the sound full and genuine, and kissed her again. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms while the fire crackled and the night deepened around them. The next few weeks were like something from a dream. Sarah and Ben fell into their new dynamic with surprising ease, as though they had been waiting their whole lives for exactly this. They worked together during the day, and in the evenings, they would sit together and talk or read or simply enjoy each other's presence. Ben began teaching Sarah to shoot, reasoning that she should know how to defend herself if she was going to live in the wilderness. Sarah proved to be a quick learner, and Ben was absurdly proud the first time she hit a target dead center. They had not yet slept together as man and wife, both agreeing without quite discussing it that they wanted to wait until they were properly married. But they stole kisses whenever the opportunity presented itself, and Ben took every excuse to touch Sarah, to brush his hand against hers or rest his palm on her back or tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ben said, "There is a circuit preacher who comes through Gold Hill about once every 2 months. He should be there in another week or so. We could go into town, get properly married, unless you want something more elaborate." "I want to marry you," Sarah said simply. "I do not care about elaborate. A preacher and you and me, that is all I need." "All right then. We will go to Gold Hill next week. I need to trade some furs anyway, and we could use more supplies. We will make a trip of it." The thought of seeing other people again was strange to Sarah. She had been living in such isolation, just her and Ben and the mountains, that the prospect of a town, even a small, rough mining camp, seemed almost overwhelming. But she wanted to be married properly. She wanted to stand before a preacher and make vows to this man who had become her entire world. The night before they were to leave for Gold Hill, as Sarah was preparing for bed, Ben called to her from the porch. "Sarah, come out here. There is something I want to show you." Sarah joined him outside and gasped at what she saw. The moon had risen, huge and full and silver, flooding the meadow with light so bright it seemed almost like day. The stars blazed overhead, and the mountains stood in dark silhouette against the sky. "It is beautiful," Sarah breathed. "There is something else," Ben said, and there was a note in his voice that made Sarah look at him curiously. "Do you remember you told me you loved music, that you had never had the chance to dance?" "Yes." "Well, I am not much of a dancer. But I learned a few steps when I was young, before I left Pennsylvania. My mother insisted all her sons know how to dance properly. And I thought, on a night like this, with the moon so bright, maybe I could teach you." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "You do not have to do that." "I want to," Ben said. He held out his large hand to her. "May I have this dance, Sarah Jenkins?" Sarah placed her hand in his, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his fingers as they closed around hers. "Yes." Ben hummed a tune as he led her out into the moonlit meadow. He placed one hand at her waist and kept hold of her other hand, positioning her carefully. "All right. The basic step is simple. Watch my feet. Step forward with your right foot when I step back with my left. Good. Now step to the side. And bring your feet together. That is it." Sarah stumbled at first, unused to following someone else's lead, but Ben was patient. He walked her through the steps slowly, humming the tune over and over until she began to catch the rhythm. Gradually, they moved from stilted, careful movements to something smoother, more natural. "You are doing wonderfully," Ben said, his voice warm with approval. "Now we are going to try turning. Just follow my lead." He guided her through a gentle turn, and suddenly they were moving together across the meadow in a real waltz. Sarah felt something open up inside her chest, a feeling of pure joy and freedom. The moonlight silvered everything, turning the world into something magical and otherworldly. Ben's face above her was gentle and focused, and she realized he was enjoying this as much as she was. "How am I doing?" Sarah asked, breathless with exertion and happiness. "You are perfect," Ben said, and then he spun her out and back in, catching her against his chest. They were both laughing now, giddy with the simple pleasure of movement and music and being together. They danced for what might have been minutes or hours, time losing all meaning under the watchful moon. Ben taught her several different steps, and Sarah picked them up quickly, her body learning the language of dance the way it learned anything with practice and patience. When they finally stopped, both breathing hard, Sarah felt exhilarated. "That was wonderful," she said, looking up at Ben with shining eyes. "I felt like I was flying." "You looked like it too," Ben said softly. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. "You are so beautiful, Sarah, so strong and brave and beautiful. I cannot believe you are real, that you are here with me." "I am real," Sarah said, "and I am here, and I am not going anywhere." Ben kissed her then, soft and sweet, and Sarah felt her whole body respond. She pressed closer to him, feeling the solid strength of him, the way his muscles shifted under his shirt. When they finally broke apart, both were trembling. "We should go in," Ben said, his voice rough. "Before I forget that I am trying to be a gentleman." Sarah laughed and let him lead her back to the cabin. That night, as she lay in bed and listened to Ben's steady breathing from his pallet by the fire, she replayed the evening in her mind. Dancing under the moon with the man she loved, feeling like she was flying, feeling like she had finally found the place where she belonged. She fell asleep smiling. The trip to Gold Hill took most of the day. They left at dawn, riding Ben's 2 horses and leading a pack animal loaded with the furs Ben intended to trade. The trail wound through the mountains, following creek beds and traversing high meadows. Sarah found herself enjoying the journey despite the soreness from riding. The landscape was spectacular, and having Ben beside her made her feel safe even in the wilderness. Gold Hill, when they finally reached it in the late afternoon, was everything Ben had warned her about and more. The The town consisted of perhaps 40 buildings clustered along a muddy main street. Most were rough board structures, though a few boasted stone foundations. Men outnumbered women by what looked like 20 to 1. The air smelled of smoke and mud and unwashed bodies. Noise spilled from every direction. Hammers ringing on metal, men shouting, a piano playing badly from inside a saloon. Sarah stayed close to Ben as they rode down the main street. She was acutely aware of the stares they attracted, particularly the looks directed at her. Ben seemed to sense her discomfort and reached over to take her hand. "We will not be here long," he said quietly. "Just long enough to trade the furs, get supplies, and find the preacher if he is in town." They stopped at the general store, a large building that seemed to serve as the commercial heart of Gold Hill. Ben helped Sarah down from her horse, and they entered together. The interior was dim and crowded with goods. Barrels of flour and sugar, bolts of fabric, tools, tinned goods, barrels of whiskey. A thin man with spectacles stood behind the counter, and his eyebrows rose when he saw Ben. "Benjamin Drake," he said. "Did not expect to see you for another month at least." "Hello, Thomas," Ben said. "I need to do some trading and get supplies, and this is Sarah Jenkins. She is going to be my wife." Thomas's eyebrows climbed even higher, and Sarah found herself subjected to a thorough scrutiny that made her want to hide behind Ben. "Your wife? Well, I will be. Congratulations." "Thank you. Is Reverend Walsh in town, do you know? Arrived yesterday, matter of fact. Staying at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. Planning to preach on Sunday, which is tomorrow, if you are interested." "We are very interested," Ben said. "Now, about those furs." While Ben conducted his business, Sarah wandered the store, looking at the goods on offer. The prices seemed astronomical compared to what she remembered from Ohio, but Ben had explained that everything had to be freighted in from far away, which drove up the cost. She found herself drawn to a bolt of blue calico, a pretty fabric that would make a nice dress. Ben finished his negotiations and came to stand beside her. "Do you like that? It is pretty. Then we will take enough for a dress, and we should get you boots that fit properly and a good warm coat for winter and whatever else you need." "Ben, I do not have money for all that." "But I do. And you are going to be my wife. Let me do this, Sarah." The tenderness in his voice made her throat tight. "All right. Thank you." They spent the next hour outfitting Sarah with proper clothing and supplies. Ben was generous but not extravagant, choosing practical items that would serve her well. By the time they finished, Sarah felt better equipped to face life in the mountains than she had since arriving in the territories. They arranged to leave most of their purchases at the store to be picked up the next day after the wedding, keeping only what they would need for the night. Then Ben led Sarah to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, a neat two-story building at the edge of town. Mrs. Henderson proved to be a plump, cheerful woman in her 50s who greeted them warmly. "2 rooms," Ben said. "One for the lady and one for me. We are getting married tomorrow and need to speak with Reverend Walsh about performing the ceremony." Mrs. Henderson's eyes lit up. "How wonderful! The Reverend is in the parlor right now, as it happens. Let me show you to your rooms first, and then I will introduce you. The room Mrs. Henderson gave Sarah was small but clean, with a real bed and a washstand. After weeks in the cabin and months before that on the trail, it seemed luxurious. Sarah freshened up as best she could, then went downstairs to meet Ben and the preacher. Reverend Walsh was a tall, thin man with kind eyes and a gentle manner. He listened as Ben explained their situation, how they had met and fallen in love and wanted to be married. If he found anything unusual about their story, he did not show it. "I would be honored to marry you," he said. "Shall we say tomorrow afternoon after the service? We could do the ceremony in the church. It is small, but it serves our purposes." "That would be perfect," Sarah said. They ate dinner at the boarding house, a meal of beef stew and fresh bread that was simple but good. Afterward, Ben walked Sarah upstairs to her room. They stood outside her door, suddenly awkward with each other in a way they had not been at the cabin. "I will see you tomorrow," Ben said softly. "Sleep well, Sarah." "You too." She rose on her toes and kissed him gently. "Good night, Ben." Sarah lay in bed that night, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. Tomorrow she would marry Ben. Tomorrow she would pledge her life to his, would take his name and join her future irrevocably to his. The thought filled her with a mix of nervousness and joy and absolute certainty that this was right. The next day dawned clear and bright. Sarah washed and dressed with care, putting on the best dress she owned, the blue calico she had been wearing when Ben found her, now cleaned and mended. She wished she had something finer for her wedding, but it would have to do. Mrs. Henderson knocked on her door mid-morning. "I thought you might like some help with your hair, dear, and I have a veil you could borrow if you want." Sarah accepted gratefully, and Mrs. Henderson proved to have a deft hand with hair. She arranged Sarah's dark locks in a style that was both elegant and practical, with a few curls framing her face. The veil was simple lace, worn but clean, and when Mrs. Henderson draped it over Sarah's head, tears sprang to Sarah's eyes. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Henderson said warmly. "That young man of yours is very lucky." "I think I am the lucky one," Sarah said softly. The church was indeed small, a simple wooden structure with rough benches and a plain altar. But sunlight streamed through the windows, and someone had put wildflowers in jars on the windowsills. A handful of townspeople had gathered, curious about the unusual wedding. Ben stood at the front of the church, and Sarah's breath caught when she saw him. He had cleaned up, trimming his beard and tying back his hair. He wore clean buckskins and a shirt that looked new. But what struck her most was the expression on his face as he watched her walk down the aisle toward him. He looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world, like he could not quite believe his good fortune. Sarah walked to his side, and he took her hand, his large fingers warm and steady around hers. Reverend Walsh began the ceremony, speaking of love and commitment and the sacred bond of marriage. Sarah heard the words as if from a distance, too focused on Ben to pay close attention. But when it came time for their vows, she spoke clearly and firmly. "I, Sarah Jenkins, take you, Benjamin Drake, to be my husband. I promise to love you, to stand by your side, to be your partner in all things, for as long as we both shall live." Ben's voice was deep and steady as he made his vows. "I, Benjamin Drake, take you, Sarah Jenkins, to be my wife. I promise to love you, to protect you, to honor you, to build a life with you that is worthy of the gift you have given me, for as long as we both shall live. By the power vested in me," Reverend Walsh said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Ben pulled Sarah close and kissed her, and the small congregation applauded. Sarah felt joy bubble up inside her, bright and effervescent. She was married. She was Mrs. Benjamin Drake. She had a home and a future and a man who loved her beyond measure. They stayed in Gold Hill for one more night, wanting to give Ben a chance to finish his trading and for them to collect all their purchases. That night, in Sarah's room at the boarding house, they finally came together as husband and wife. Ben was gentle and patient, and Sarah felt treasured in a way she had never imagined possible. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, and Ben stroked her hair while Sarah traced the scars on his chest. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. "Happier than I have ever been," Sarah said honestly. "You, more than I can express." Ben kissed the top of her head. "I keep thinking about how close I came to never meeting you." If I had gone a different direction that day, if I had not seen your tracks, if you had given up just a little sooner, I almost missed you, Sarah. The thought terrifies me. But you did not miss me. We found each other, and now we have the rest of our lives together." "The rest of our lives," Ben repeated, as if savoring the words. "I like the sound of that." They returned to the cabin the next day, and life resumed its rhythm, but everything felt different now, charged with new meaning. Sarah threw herself into making the cabin truly their home. She sewed curtains for the windows from fabric Ben had bought in Gold Hill. She organized the kitchen and started putting up preserves from the garden's bounty. She planted flowers near the porch, wanting beauty as well as utility. Ben built Sarah a proper desk where she could write and keep the household accounts. He carved her a rocking chair for the porch, working on it in secret and presenting it to her with shy pride. He showed her more of the surrounding wilderness, taking her to his favorite spots. A waterfall hidden in a canyon, a meadow where orchids grew in spring, a cave filled with interesting rock formations. As summer gave way to fall, Sarah and Ben settled into married life with remarkable ease. They worked well together, anticipating each other's needs and supporting each other's efforts. They talked and laughed and made love and built the kind of partnership Sarah had always dreamed of, but never quite believed existed. One evening in late September, as they sat on the porch watching the first snow dust the high peaks, Sarah said, "I think I might be pregnant." Ben's head whipped around so fast Sarah had to suppress a smile. "Are you certain?" "Not completely. But I have missed my courses and I have been feeling sick in the mornings. I think it is likely." Ben's face transformed, lighting up with such joy that Sarah felt her heart squeeze. He pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully as though she might break. "A baby," he whispered. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy about it?" "Happy, Sarah, I am ecstatic, terrified but ecstatic. Are you all right? Do you feel all right? Should you be resting more?" Sarah laughed at his sudden concern. "I am fine. Women have been having babies forever. I am healthy and strong, and we have months to prepare." Over the following weeks, as Sarah's pregnancy became certain, Ben fussed over her in ways that were both endearing and occasionally annoying. He insisted she not lift anything heavy, that she rest frequently, that she eat more than she wanted. Sarah put up with it because she recognized it came from love and fear of losing her or the baby. They prepared through the fall and early winter for the coming child. Ben built a cradle from smooth pine, carving it with images of mountains and trees. Sarah sewed tiny clothes from soft fabric, her hands creating garments for a person she had not yet met but already loved. They argued happily about names, unable to agree but enjoying the discussion. Winter came to the mountains with a vengeance, bringing deep snow and bitter cold. But the cabin was snug and warm, and Ben had laid in ample supplies. They spent the long evenings reading aloud to each other or playing music or simply talking. Sarah taught Ben to dance properly, showing him the steps she had learned from him and adding new ones from her memory. They would waltz around the cabin in their stockinged feet, laughing when they bumped into furniture. Sarah's pregnancy progressed smoothly. By midwinter, she was showing clearly, her belly swelling with their child. Ben would sometimes put his hand on her stomach and marvel at the movements he could feel there, this new life they had created together. "I never thought I would have this," he said one night, his hand splayed across her belly. "A family, a child. I had convinced myself that this kind of happiness was not meant for me." "Well, you were wrong," Sarah said, echoing words she had spoken months earlier. "You deserve all of this and more." The baby came in April, just as the snow was beginning to melt and the first wildflowers were pushing through the ground. Sarah's labor started at dawn, and Ben, for all his usual competence was nearly useless with worry. Sarah actually had to calm him down, reassuring him that everything was proceeding normally, that she was all right. It was a long labor, lasting through the day and into the night. Ben held Sarah's hand, wiped her brow, encouraged her when she grew tired. And finally, as the moon rose over the mountains, their son was born. Ben cut the cord with steady hands and wrapped the baby in the soft blankets Sarah had prepared. Then he placed the child in Sarah's arms, and they both stared down at the tiny, perfect person they had made. "He is beautiful," Ben whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You are amazing. You did this, Sarah. You brought him into the world. We did this," Sarah corrected, exhausted but filled with wonder. Together. They named him Thomas after Sarah's brother and William after Ben's father. Thomas William Drake, born in a cabin in the Wyoming wilderness to parents who loved him before they even knew him. The early months with baby Thomas were exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. He was a good baby, healthy and strong-lunged, with his father's blue-green eyes and his mother's dark hair. Ben was a devoted father, taking on diaper changes and night feedings with surprising grace. Sarah would often wake in the night to find him sitting in the rocking chair he had made, the baby cradled against his broad chest, both of them peaceful and content. As spring turned to summer, they developed new routines that accommodated their growing family. Sarah would work in the expanded garden with Thomas nearby in a blanket-lined basket, watching the clouds and the birds. Ben would take breaks from his chores to play with his son, making silly faces that sent Thomas into gales of laughter. One evening when Thomas was about 6 months old, Ben said, "I want to add onto the cabin. Give us more space. Maybe build a proper bedroom and expand the living area." "That would be wonderful," Sarah agreed, "and perhaps eventually a schoolroom. I want to make sure Thomas has a proper education, even living out here. We could hire a teacher to come stay with us for a few months each year," Ben suggested. "I know a woman in Gold Hill who taught at an academy back east. She might be willing, and there are books. We can give him books and knowledge and all the tools he needs to make his own choices about his future." They talked late into the night about their plans, about the life they wanted to build for their son and any future children they might have. Sarah felt overwhelmed by gratitude for this life she had stumbled into, for this man who had saved her and loved her and given her more than she had ever dreamed possible. 2 years later, Ben finished the addition to the cabin. They now had 2 bedrooms, a larger living space, and a separate room that served as both Ben's workshop and Sarah's study. Thomas, now a sturdy toddler, had free run of the place, exploring and investigating everything with the fearless curiosity of childhood. Sarah was pregnant again, and this time they hoped for a girl. Ben had picked out a name, Rose, after the wild roses that grew in the meadow where he had taught Sarah to dance. Sarah loved the name and loved the memory it honored. Rose was born in October, during the golden weeks when the aspen turned yellow and the air carried the first hints of coming winter. She was smaller than Thomas had been, more delicate, with Ben's coloring and Sarah's features. Ben held his daughter for the first time and cried openly, overcome by the depth of his love for this tiny person. Life continued to expand and deepen. Ben took on occasional work guiding hunting parties or serving as a scout, which brought in extra money and kept his skills sharp. Sarah started writing, recording stories of her journey west and her life in the mountains. She had no plans to publish them, but she wanted Thomas and Rose to know their history, to understand what their parents had overcome to build this life. The children grew. Thomas became a capable helper, learning from his father's example to be competent and responsible. Rose was quieter but equally smart, with a love for plants and animals that delighted Sarah. Ben taught them to read and write and cipher, while Sarah taught them history and literature and music. They brought in a tutor for a few months each year, as they had planned, ensuring the children received proper education despite their isolation. When Thomas was 8 and Rose was 6, Sarah gave birth to twins, healthy boys they named Samuel and Jacob. The cabin seemed to burst with life and noise and chaos, and Sarah and Ben would sometimes look at each other across the dinner table and shake their heads in wonder at how full their lives had become. The years passed in a pattern of seasons and growth. Thomas eventually left to attend college back east, determined to become an engineer. Rose stayed closer to home, marrying a rancher from the valley to the north and settling within a day's ride of the cabin. Samuel and Jacob, inseparable as twins often are, became hunting guides, working alongside their father and eventually taking over much of the business. Sarah and Ben grew older together, their faces weathering and their hair turning gray, but the love between them never dimmed. They still danced on clear nights under the moon, moving more slowly now, but with the same joy they had felt that first time. They still sat together on the porch and talked about everything and nothing. They still found comfort and home in each other. One evening, when they were both in their 60s and their children were grown with families of their own, Sarah and Ben sat on the porch watching the sunset. Grandchildren played in the meadow, their laughter carrying on the wind. The cabin Ben had built had been expanded several times over the years to accommodate visiting family, and it now sprawled across the valley floor, a testament to the life they had built together. "You ever regret it?" Ben asked, taking Sarah's hand in his. "Staying here instead of going to Gold Hill, choosing this life over something more conventional?" Sarah looked at her husband, at his weathered face and his white hair, and his eyes that still looked at her with wonder. She thought about the scared, exhausted girl she had been when he found her, about the journey that had brought her to that moment. She thought about all the years that had followed, the joys and struggles and everyday moments that had woven together into a life more rich and fulfilling than anything she could have imagined. "Not for a single moment," Sarah said. "You saved me, Ben. Not just from dying on the prairie, but from a life half lived. You gave me love and home and purpose. You gave me dancing under the moon and children and a life that is entirely, authentically mine. How could I possibly regret that?" Ben lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "You saved me too. I was just existing before you came, not really living. You made everything mean something. You made me want to be better, to build something lasting." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank behind the mountains they had called home for so long. The moon was rising, full and bright, and Sarah could hear music drifting from inside the cabin where some of the grandchildren were learning to play the piano Ben had freighted in years ago. "Dance with me," Sarah said suddenly. "One more time under the moon." Ben smiled and stood, helping Sarah to her feet. They moved into the meadow, into the silvery moonlight, and began to dance. Their steps were slower now, not as smooth as they once had been, but the love between them transformed every movement into something beautiful. Sarah closed her eyes and let herself feel it all. The cool mountain air, the solid strength of Ben's arms around her, the music of the night surrounding them. She felt like flying, just as she had that first time so many years ago. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that she had found exactly where she belonged. They danced until the moon was high overhead, and then they went inside to their family, to the life they had built together in these mountains. Behind them, the wilderness stretched away in every direction, wild and beautiful and home. Years later, when Sarah was 73 and Ben was 78, They celebrated 50 years of marriage surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. The gathering filled the expanded cabin and spilled out onto the grounds, 3 generations of family that existed because 2 people had found each other on a moonlit prairie so long ago. Thomas gave a speech about his parents, about their courage and love and the example they had set. Rose presented them with a quilt made from fabric from all the places the family had traveled, a tapestry of their shared history. Samuel and Jacob performed a song they had written about the mountain man and the woman he taught to dance. But the moment Sarah treasured most came at the end of the evening, when the younger folks had taken the children off to bed and only Sarah and Ben and their 4 grown children remained on the porch, watching the stars come out. "You did good, Ma and Pa," Thomas said quietly. "You built something real here, something that matters." "We just loved each other," Ben said, his arm around Sarah's shoulders. "Everything else grew from that." "It was enough," Sarah added. "More than enough." They sat together in the mountain darkness, a family forged from loss and luck and love, and Sarah felt complete. She had never danced, all those years ago, until Ben taught her steps under the moon. And in learning to dance, she had learned to fly, to live fully, to embrace a life bigger and wilder than anything she had imagined. The story could have ended there, but Sarah and Ben had a few more years together. They grew more frail but remained sharp of mind, telling stories to their great-grandchildren and offering advice to anyone who asked. They never stopped dancing, though their dances became slower, shorter, just a few steps on the porch when the moon was right. Ben passed first in his sleep one winter night, his hand in Sarah's. Sarah grieved deeply but found comfort in their children and in the life they had shared. She lived another 2 years, spending her final days in the cabin Ben had built, surrounded by family and the mountains they had both loved. When Sarah died, peacefully in her sleep with her children by her side, they buried her next to Ben in the meadow where they had first danced. The whole family gathered for the funeral, 3 generations strong, and they each told stories about Sarah and Ben, and the love that had shaped all their lives. After everyone else had left, Rose stayed behind, standing by her parents' graves as the sun set behind the mountains. The moon was rising, full and bright, and on impulse, Rose began to dance. She moved through the steps her father had taught her mother, that her mother had taught her, the simple waltz that had started everything. And as she danced in the moonlit meadow, Rose could almost see them. Her father, strong and capable, and her mother, brave and beautiful, dancing together under the stars. Forever young, forever in love, forever home in these Wyoming mountains. The cabin still stands, maintained by the family as a reminder of where they came from. And sometimes, on nights when the moon is full, people say you can see 2 figures dancing in the meadow, moving together with perfect grace, the mountain man and the woman he taught to fly.